Good morning and hello to the US and good evening to Denmark. My name is Allan Christensen. I'm Science and Innovation Attaché at the Danish Innovation Center in Silicon Valley. Welcome to this Carbon Removal Summit organized by the Innovation Center together with State of Green and the Danish Energy Agency, and not the least in partnership with Carbon 180, Air Miners, and the US Embassy in Copenhagen. Thank you all for participating here today. We have representatives from the growing carbon removal communities on both sides of the Atlantic, both in the sessions and in the audience. The aim of this event is to kick off bridge building between the US and Denmark to foster international collaboration on getting carbon removal to scale. As we all know, carbon removal is complex. Therefore, it's important to emphasize that carbon removal efforts are an additional focus on top of energy efficiency efforts and also reducing emissions. It's not a way to continue fossil energy use in the long term. Today's event will start with an opening session of welcoming remarks and a keynote. Next, we will have 3 panel discussions focusing on leading entrepreneurs in carbon removal, what we need from research and development, and how policy can get the ball rolling. We encourage you to participate in the discussions. Feel free to use the Q&A function to submit questions. Also, use the opportunity for networking. We encourage you to use the chat function to connect, let others know your interest and how we can help each other. Today is very much about exploring and building foundation for new partnerships and networks in order to move forward the development and deployment of carbon removal projects. In the fall, we will continue the conversation in 2 or 3 deep dive discussions, and your input today will help us shape these follow-up activities. One final remark before we begin. The event today is carbon negative, inspired by Air Miners and enabled by the Danish startup Keynote platform. Carbon negative means, as you all know, that we remove more CO2 than we emit during this event. And now let's move on to our first speaker. It's a great pleasure to welcome the Danish Minister of Climate, Energy and Utilities, Mr. Dan Jørgensen, for the first opening remark.
Technology has the potential to change the way we live. Sometimes new technology surpasses even our wildest dreams. I certainly did not imagine that I would be paying my bills, booking my vacation or watching TV on my phone before the smartphone was invented. But once new technologies become part of our daily lives, we often wonder how we ever lived without them. Take waste management, for example. Copenhagen, the city where I live, was founded in 1167, but it took 810 years before the city started to collect the waste material of its inhabitants. Today, waste management, of course, works perfectly. Trash is picked up and recycled or even converted into energy. That, unfortunately, does not apply to our CO2 emissions. When factories, cars, ships or planes operate, they freely emit CO2 into the atmosphere. But the fact simply is that we cannot afford to not stem climate change, and we cannot stem it without achieving negative emissions. We must begin to capture, transport and store away carbon emissions safely. Now, we don't have the 810 years that it took Copenhagen to organize its waste management. That is why the first part of the Danish government's carbon capture and storage strategy, launched 3 months ago, aims to ensure the first carbon capture projects already in 2025. However, Denmark alone only accounts for 0.1% of the global greenhouse gas emissions. Thus, we are conscious of the need to leverage our impact through international partnerships. Earlier this year, my government and the US Department of Energy signed an MOU that provides a framework for the discussions we will have at this event today. Furthermore, I'm delighted to see the partners in California join the conversation. But partnerships are not only needed at government level. We need to work with the companies that are developing the technology throughout the CCUS value chain. For capture, transportation and infrastructure, for geological storage solutions, and for utilization. It is a daunting challenge because, unlike trash, CO2 is not only invisible, It's also more difficult to capture, transport, and store. If it was easy to do, we would already have done it. Thus, I'm delighted that the panels today address both innovation, research funding, and the policies needed to mature and deploy CCUS technologies. I think it's fair to say that the people attending this conference each hold a piece of the puzzle. All of you are frontrunners, so let us work together. Let us inspire the rest of the world by creating solutions that can be used around the planet. Thank you.
Thank you to the Minister for a wonderful opening remark on the importance of carbon removal, international collaboration, and for underlying that each of us holds an important piece of the puzzle. Our next speaker for an opening remark is Chargé d'Affaires Stuart Dwyer from the US Embassy in Copenhagen. Mr. Stuart Dwyer, it's a true pleasure and an honor to have you here with us today. The scene is yours.
Great, thanks very much, Alan, and thanks to you and the organizers of this event. Very timely. And I want to echo Minister Jorgensen's remarks. We see this partnership and the MOU that was signed with DOE is absolutely critical to our common efforts in addressing climate change. And I'll just say I was up in Greenland about 10 days ago, had the opportunity to fly with NASA on one of their research missions, looking at the impact of the warming oceans on glacial melt. And nothing like being on the front lines with the scientists doing the sort of leading edge science on this to give you a sense of urgency of what we're addressing. And I know I don't have to tell this crowd that, but I think as we look at the run up to COP26, like the president's words at UNGA last week, in increasing sort of the need to increase the level of ambition. And the way we do that is to show concretely the way forward. And I think it was mentioned earlier that the cheaper solution usually means avoiding emissions in the first place, but carbon removal is going to be an absolutely critical part of the puzzle. It's something in a previous tour, I had the opportunity in Canada to work with DOE colleagues who I know are on the line on a project there. And subsequently was able to go out to Calgary, where they had some of the finalists in the Carbon X Prize, and really was inspired by some of the innovation going on in this sector. And I know we've got one of the companies who was very successful, I won't ruin the plot line, who was participating in this event today, but suffice it to say that I think the combination of sort of some of the innovation that these companies are doing and Denmark's role as sort of a test bed for all of these kinds of technologies is really exciting. And you know, I just came from the Danish Business Summit. Carbon capture technology was mentioned twice, both by the Prime Minister as well as one of Denmark's business leaders, as an example of the kind of technology that they need to learn more about and will need to implement in those hard to abate sectors. So really excited about today's event. Thank you so much for working with us, and we look forward to continuing the collaboration.
Thank you, Stuart, for this inspiring opening remark, and also to the Embassy in Copenhagen for helping out organizing this event. It's a pleasure working with you, and we look forward to continue our collaboration in moving this important agenda forward. And now it's time to move on to our opening keynote. It's a great pleasure to welcome Dr. Julio Friedman, who is with us here today. Julio Friedman is a senior research scholar with the Center of Global Energy Policy at Columbia University. Friedman is also a senior advisor with Carbon Direct and a distinguished associate with the Energy Futures Initiative. Furthermore, Friedman also has experience from Lawrence Livermore National Lab and the US Department of Energy. Dr. Friedman is a PhD in geology from University of Southern California, and he is also alumnus of MIT. Before welcoming you to the stage, Dr. Friedman, we want to thank you for being very helpful with sharing knowledge with the Danish Minister of Climate and Energy, and also with the Danish politicians in the Parliament. It's a great pleasure to welcome you here today. The stage is yours.
Thank you so much. I'm really delighted and grateful to be here. Thank you to the ministry, and in particular to Minister Jorgensen. I'd like to thank the consulates in New York and in Palo Alto, and specifically the Innovation Center in Silicon Valley. Following the minister's comments and the chargé d'affaires comments, I can only more strenuously agree that the time for happy talk is over. While we show greater ambition, and I'm pleased by the growth of ambition, we have to be clear-eyed about where we're at. Annual emissions continue to grow year on year. We are simply not making the progress we would like to make. And every year we emit greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. They will stay there for centuries, and the stock of greenhouse gas in the atmosphere grows and the climate does not stabilize. As a consequence, the growing urgency around the climate challenge means doing more. Literally, more urgency means more. More money, less time. Doing more means net zero by 2050, period. If we do not reach net zero by 2050, the consequences of our actions will be terrible. And that's now very well understood from the science and from the economics. Doing more, however, also includes adding CO2 removal to CO2 reduction. That both are important tools of abatement. We must reduce emissions profoundly and quickly. And we also know that reduction of emissions is not sufficient. We must also remove the stocks in the atmosphere. Net zero math, net zero arithmetic means removing what you cannot reduce. That's the framework now of over 2,000 entities around the world and 150 governments, that you must remove what you can't reduce. Doing more also includes capturing CO2, especially from point sources that are hard to abate in any other way. Cement, for example, other industrial sources, ships. It goes on and on. It's very hard to reduce the emissions in these sectors. But capturing CO2 is one way to do that. And specifically, if we capture CO2 from waste to energy facilities, whether we are making power or hydrogen, as Minister Jurgensen said in Copenhagen, they're beginning to do this now, and that will both reduce and remove emissions. Lots. The opportunity for CO2 removal by combining waste to energy systems with carbon capture is immense, and absolutely one of the things that must happen quickly and that requires investment in innovation. That technology is well established. Denmark is an international leader on the deployment of this. Denmark, Norway's got nothing on you. You guys are way ahead. But that is still not enough. Doing more includes adding technology options to natural options. We know that trees and mangroves and soil can take up CO2. We also know that we need to do a great deal more of that. We must preserve our existing forests. We know that's also not enough. We must add technology options simply for the arithmetic, simply to balance our carbon books and our carbon obligations. That includes new technologies like direct air capture. We witnessed the birth of a new species a few weeks ago in Iceland, the Orca facility, that is now removing 4,000 tons a year of CO2 from the air and oceans. That's a good start. One down, 1 million plants like that to go. We need 4 billion tons of CO2 removal, and we need it in a very small amount of time. The good news is those plants are coming. The Climeworks facility will grow in scale in the next few years. Other companies like Carbon Engineering and Global Thermostat are also building larger facilities quickly. I expect that by mid-decade, by the end of 2025, we will have at least one plant pulling 1 million tons of CO2 a year out of the air and oceans. That's also good. That means we only need 4,000 of those. The work is the work. Whether we're optimistic or pessimistic, that's the job. We have to get to gigaton removal as part of the climate obligations and part of the climate counterstrike. And we can harness the abundant clean energy around the world, including things like offshore wind, for this task. Doing more also means innovation. The International Energy Agency and Bill Gates are in agreement on this. 50% of the solutions we need to deploy are not deployed at the scale we need them today. We must turn clean energy into things like hydrogen and synthetic fuels. That requires innovation, new catalysts, new technologies, new business models, new regulations, innovation on all fronts. We must create a circular carbon economy. And part of that will be upcycling CO2 that we pull from the air and oceans and turning it into new things, into fuels and building materials. Denmark, again, is leading in this context. Among other things, the recent announcement of Novo Nordisk's investment in a carbon tech center at Aarhus University shows the commitment to innovation and some of what needs to be done. If we do this right, if we invest in innovation, if we create these new technologies, we will decolonize the air and oceans, and we will create opportunities for economic growth around the world, including in developing nations, including in disadvantaged communities. However, more means more, and doing more than anything else, means partnerships, and it means a generous spirit. We have to find ways to bridge differences. We have to find ways to work together that are new. We have to make enduring commitments that cross national boundaries, that cross sectors, that cross ideological divides. That work is every bit as important as the other work in achieving a just and sustainable greenhouse gas-free economy. It is just as important as anything else to make net zero emissions worldwide real. This is the climate counterstrike. We must pour our hearts and minds and spirits into the moral task of restoring our climate and addressing prior inequities. Denmark is leading the charge. The United States stands shoulder to shoulder with them, and I am so pleased to join this event to celebrate their leadership and their partnership. I hope to have a chance to answer some questions now.
Thank you, Julio, for an inspiring keynote. Let me just put a question to you. How do you think we should drive down some of the costs that are associated with these initiatives? Where in the value chain do you see the largest potential for cost reductions?
So we know the recipe for cost reduction. We've done this for everything from LEDs to flat screen TVs to solar panels. We know the recipe. It starts with sustained investment in innovation. And it starts with data sharing and knowledge sharing pre-commercial. It then requires market aligning policies started by the government. Things like government procurement are ways to create early markets. That was true for batteries, for fuel cells, for solar panels, for nuclear plants, you name it. Clean energy starts with governments buying as well as investing. That creates companies, that creates supply chains, that creates learnings, and that creates ways to make it even faster to reduce costs. Once the cost reductions reach a certain point, the cost reductions really are the province of deployment. We must start deploying these things at scale and at speed. And again, market aligning policies, whether it is regulatory, like the European Trading Scheme, or incentives in the US, like tax credits of various kinds, when people realize that they can generate wealth, then the projects become financeable and people can invest. And so there's no mystery about this. And there are way more ways to reduce costs than most people realize. For things like direct air capture, it could be novel solvents or sorbents, new materials. It could be better contactors and engineered systems. It can be better heat recovery. It can be better efficiency. It can be industrial scaling. It can be mass production. All of these are ways to get this stuff done, but the only way it happens is if we field units. We have to spend some money and put stuff into the world.
Thank you. And if we move on to the technologies, where do you see the largest technological challenges going this way?
One of the reasons I remain optimistic these days is that the technical challenges are small. The technical challenges are resolvable. So for, let's say, biohydrogen, turning waste into hydrogen and capturing that CO2, we have pyrolysis technologies which can do the job. There are issues with them, but we can improve and fix those. We have gasification technologies that are sold around the world at large scale and can do the job. We have boilers and combustors and cleaning units that can avoid the impacts to local communities that have been done well for many, many years. So that technology exists. Really what we need to do is we need to focus on the benefits. The technology investments need to maximize the benefits, and that can be done either by reducing the cost, improving the integration, improving the performance, or making it better for communities. And all of those are very straightforward, actually. And we can do that with biohydrogen, we can do that with direct air capture, we can do that with mineralization, we can do that with biochar. There's many things that we can do to facilitate this transition.
And staying on this note, just for a second more, how do you see the interplay between public funded research and private driven research in companies? Obviously, it needs to collaborate, but how? And can we support it in better ways than we do today?
Sure. It's become it's said so often now that it almost doesn't need to be said, but public-private partnerships are the work. Public-private partnerships are the work. Companies want to do this, but they cannot launch on their own. The risks are too high. Governments want to manifest public benefits, but it is suboptimal for them to do all the work. They simply don't have the skills and the efficient labor force to do the job. So we must partner together to do these things. In terms of how this is done, I'm pretty open. Some of that will get done through grants. The Department of Energy in particular is very good at grant making and has a rich history of doing that to get technologies to market. In some cases, it can be done through, say, feed-in tariffs or contracts for differences, which provide ways for financing to run to projects which can then work their way down the curve. I think data sharing is important. I think the creation of standards is important. In many cases, we do not, you cannot rely on industry to make standards for itself. And this is a good role for government. And I'm actually quite pleased to see the European Commission and the EU taking up the standards of CO2 removal as part of their work. But this is a team sport. Everybody gets to help on this. There is work for everybody in a net zero economy.
So if you were to give an advice on the next 2 or 3 immediate steps that you would recommend for politicians to take to get this started, do you have any comment on this?
There's 3 things that I would tell policymakers generically. In specifics, there's a lot of different things that I would say, but overall, there's 3 things I would say. First, don't be scared. You're not going to lose your job. The money's going to be well spent. It's going to be okay. The second thing I would say is spend the money. This can't be done for free. It will come from ratepayers, it will come from taxpayers, or it will come from shareholders, but the money's going to come from somewhere. And we need to build. We need to combine a construction agenda with a reduction agenda. If we spend it with that focus, then that will help. And then the third thing I would say is focus on the tons. There are ancillary benefits to be got everywhere. We can create jobs, we can create wealth, we can make cleaner air, we can make cleaner water. But if you don't focus on the tons, we're going to end up in the wrong place. And we're going to spend a bunch of money on stuff that doesn't reduce and doesn't remove greenhouse gases. So don't be scared, spend the money, focus on the tons.
Thank you, Julio, and thank you very much for being here with us today and for giving us an enlightening overview of the state of the various carbon removal pathways.
Oh, sorry, sorry, if I may, one last thought.
Yes.
I get one last thought.
Yeah.
It is always smart to invest in innovation.
Yes.
Always. It is the best return on investment governments ever make. So that is a place to start that is risk-free and really, really rewarding. Thank you so much. Sorry to interrupt you.
Thank you so much.
Look forward to the rest of the event.
Thank you very much. And now we will just wait for the last panelist to join the event. So while we are waiting, we will run a short video in a second, and then we will be back when we have the next panel ready for you to attend.
By 2050, Denmark will be independent of fossil fuels, an energy-efficient society powered by renewables, fueled by nature. We're well on the way to a greener future, but we're not quite there yet. Let's share experiences and inspire each other to continue the journey. It was the oil crises in the 1970s that triggered our green transition. We began to invest in renewable energy and focus on energy-efficient solutions to break our dependence on imported oil. Since 1980, Denmark's economy has grown by more than 100%. While our energy consumption has remained the same, and our greenhouse gas emissions have been reduced. But we still need to make progress. Sustainable energy sources must be harnessed globally and across borders. We need to create a balanced, intelligent energy system to power our common future. Around 70% of Denmark's electricity is generated by renewables. We invest in green infrastructure and technologies across biomass, solar, geothermal energy, and not least wind energy. Our degree of self-sufficiency is around 70%. Denmark is part of an international energy infrastructure that ensures flexibility and security of supply. To finance the green transition, we foster public and private partnerships and let citizens invest through shared ownership. A key driver for green growth is energy efficiency. Buildings alone account for 40% of global energy consumption. However, existing technology for energy renovation and retrofitting can save at least 50%. Investing in energy renovations is also good business with a high return on investment and short payback times. Everyone can benefit from energy-efficient solutions, for instance, through district heating. In Copenhagen, the capital of Denmark, more than 95% of households are connected to district heating.
Yes, and now we will move on to the next item on the agenda, the first out of three panel sessions focusing on leading entrepreneurs in carbon removal. To moderate this session, we are privileged to have Mr. Jason Grillo from the Air Miners with us today. Jason, will you introduce yourself and also Air Miners, and then take it from here?
Excellent. Thank you so much for such a lovely introduction. And thank you to the Innovation Center of Denmark in Silicon Valley. Thank you to State of Green. It's always tough. It's tough following Dr. Julio Friedman. So thank you so much for all of your remarks prior. So my name is Jason Grillo. I'm with Air Miners. We have a esteemed panel for our discussion of entrepreneurship in carbon removal today. When thinking about this, approaching the state of carbon removal right now, it's very much an entrepreneurial industry. We need 1,000 shots on goal to achieve the multiple gigatons of carbon removed from the atmosphere over the coming years. And to that end, finding ways to foster and grow the state of entrepreneurship in carbon removal is crucial. Some of the leading companies in carbon removal today were just small startups not very long ago. And so when we talk about entrepreneurs today who are just getting their own companies going, that means that they might be the next large scale carbon removal companies in short time. We need to create an ecosystem focused on entrepreneurship with players from government, from innovative funding sources, such as venture capital, public-private partnerships, accelerators, etc. To say nothing of the role of first buyers for those crucial initial projects for removing carbon from the atmosphere. Our panel today can speak to some of the successes and challenges that we see in the ecosystem of carbon removal, some of the places that have been helpful and some of the gaps. And to that end, before too long, I want to get to the panelists who are being assembled today. One is Dante Simonetti, co-founder of a company called Sea Change out of California, also Rahul Shendure, the CEO of Carbon Built, also in California, and Peter Reinhardt from Charm Industrial, who will be joining us shortly. The idea behind air miners, just to back up for a second, is that we are a place that helps founders and entrepreneurs and innovators and scientists and designers, investors connect with each other. Making those connections is one of the things that I'd like to use an audience to take away from today. And with that, I'm going to cede the floor to first, why don't we start with Dante to discuss a little bit about sea change, some of the connections that we want to make, and what the nature of your company is. Dante.
Well, thank you, Jason, for the introduction. My name is Dante Simonetti. In addition to being one of the co-founders of Sea Change, I'm also a professor of chemical engineering at UCLA, where the initial ideas and concepts of the Sea Change technology were started. And we're in the process right now of really breaking through what I want to call the translational wall for this technology that focuses on novel reactors, novel process designs for seawater mineralization to sequester CO2. And I think from a standpoint, we talk about entrepreneurship in this industry, it really takes, I think, three things. So it takes one, it takes obviously an idea. Two, it takes traditional investors, traditional entrepreneurs to give quanta of money for us to kind of grow the technology. And it really also requires kind of traditional heavy industry investment that comes on the back end after technology is de-risked. And then governments play a role in helping to bridge the gap between smaller investments that get it out of the lab to this translational wall, and then the piloting and prototyping that it takes to kind of extend it to where a company would like to then build these things up. So that's where our process is right now. We're really looking at scale up. We're really looking at taking a process out of the lab and into the pilot plant area.
Which is a critical stage of early startup formation. Having that university and private company relationship is critical. It's critical in the, my experience in the biotechnology industry. It's going to be critical, I foresee, in carbon removal. Rahul, please, would love to hear a little bit more about Carbon Built and what your technology is and how you're aiming to connect today.
Yeah, thanks, Jason, and thanks for the Innovation Center of Denmark for the invitation. So Carbon Built's mission is to enable concrete product manufacturing to drive gigaton scale carbon dioxide removals and reductions, emissions reductions. So concrete's widely recognized as an important, and maybe the most important, carbon utilization opportunity from the standpoint of scale and economics, but we haven't had solutions that can really deliver on that promise today, and that's what we're focused on. Concrete's the most voluminous man-made material in the world, second only to water in terms of its usage by humankind. It's mostly rock and sand, but importantly, 10 to 15% is cement. And the production of that material is responsible for almost 10% of global CO2 emissions, half of which coming from the core product chemistry of turning limestone into calcium oxide, and the rest from the heat that's required to drive that reaction, which today requires a lot of coal. So with regards to carbon footprint of concrete, there's two main improvement opportunities. First is substituting cement with lower carbon materials that deliver the required performance. And the second is using CO2 rather than water in the curing process. That's the process of hardening the concrete after it's placed in its form. So we're commercializing a process that uses widely available, low cost and low carbon materials to substitute for the cement. Importantly, these deliver a 10 to 30% reduction in the raw materials costs. And then it cures that mixture at ambient pressure and low temperature without a need for concentrated or purified CO2. And again, if you don't have to be a chemical engineer to understand that all those are code words for low cost and in terms of the process. And low cost is critical because at the end of the day, concrete's a commodity, and if we're going to scale, we need to compete at those levels. In developed markets, we're primarily going to market with a retrofit offering, and in high growth markets, we'll be focused on integration of the technology into greenfield plants. We demonstrated the opportunity or the technology at 1/10 scale or thereabouts through the XPRIZE competition and a subsequent demo. And we anticipate being in production at commercial scale in early Q3 of next year. I think one of the questions that was asked was, what are we hoping to do here? We've been primarily focused in the States. So we're definitely interested in connecting with partners in Europe, industrial CO2 emitters, distributed carbon dioxide generators, and concrete product producers. So look forward to the discussion.
Okay, great. And Peter, round us out. Would love to hear a little bit more about Charm and how you're aiming to connect today.
Awesome, and sorry I'm running late. So yeah, great to be here. Excited to spend some time with all of you. I'm Peter Reinhardt, co-founder and CEO at Charm Industrial, and we are working to scale up bio-oil sequestration and bio-oil production for steel manufacturing. So about 18 months ago, my co-founder Sean figured out a new carbon removal pathway where we can take plants that have captured CO2 out of the atmosphere, convert it into bio-oil, and then inject it deep underground. And we've started sequestering carbon earlier this year in January. We've sequestered thousands of tons so far this year, and currently sort of compete mostly with direct air capture companies like Climeworks and Carbon Engineering. So very excited about the progress that we've made. I'm particularly interested in connecting with potential off-takers of carbon removal, engineered carbon removal, or learning more about the steel industry, connecting with folks in the steel industry, which is really key for our kind of long-term scale.
Okay, great. Thank you, Peter. So just to start us off, you've all three have achieved successes in either delivering product or working with first buyers, or in Rahul's case, again, winning the first XPRIZE competition for carbon utilization. So congratulations on your successes. Thinking back on what it was like when you were just starting off, what were some of the obstacles that you saw? What do you wish you had more of? What are the challenges at that early stage company formation that you like to see that were blockers for you at that point?
I'm happy to jump in first, unless you had someone else, Jason, in mind.
Please.
So I'll reflect here on multiple, climate tech startups. So I started or was early at a microbially derived fuels and chemicals company back in 2006 timeframe, and started a ocean energy company around 2010, and now Carbon Built. And I think it's very clear it's never been easier to start a company than it is today. So I think, while we can look at challenges, certainly things that could be made simpler between government support, investor support, incentives, voluntary carbon markets, like that whole ecosystem is in a place that is really amazing relative to where we've been, particularly for the last decade. And so I think that's the first thing I would say, is that while there are challenges and there's things we can do better, it's a great time today to be starting a company. In terms of blockers, I think the thing I would say that I notice the most right now is the lack of sort of standards and transparency. And it's hard to expect that to happen, because there's plenty of uncertainty and differences in philosophy and perspective. But I will say that's, it's not getting in the way of us moving. But I think as these opportunities in our companies scale up, we need to focus collectively on getting those kind of pieces in place so that it doesn't become a challenge.
I think I would add, a few years ago, there was really no capital in the climate space. Like, it was it's almost hard to imagine, because it's changed so dramatically in the last 2 or 3 years. But I think when we were getting started, it was a little oddball in 2018. And part of the reason for that is that, at least in carbon removal, there was basically no buyer. There was no market. There was no revenue stream of reasonable size. And what shifted, I think, in the last few years is one, Stripe showed up and said, we're going to buy at any price. And then Shopify and Microsoft said the same thing. And all of a sudden you had a market. And as soon as you had a market, then all of a sudden the investment gates opened as people also started to realize that nature-based solutions were 85% fraudulent, it turns out, from the latest research from Berkeley and Oxford. And so people are starting to realize that there's going to be a huge shift towards high quality engineered carbon removals. And there's actually a market starting to show up where people are putting down real money. And so that shift of buyers coming into the market, I think is super important and has totally changed the dynamic. But it's also just getting started. The entire engineered carbon removal market today is probably $10 or $20 million a year. It's a de minimis market. And so I think something that I think governments can play governments and the ecosystem more broadly can play a huge role in is showing up as a buyer, showing up to procure high quality carbon removals that are going to be permanent and additional, no leakage, fix all the issues that have happened with nature-based offsets. And I think that would be hugely accelerative to the space and to startups broadly.
And Dante,
So I'd like to just, I think the comments have been great. I'll sum it up as two, I'm not going to call them blockers, but I'll refer to them as barriers. So you have carbon removal as being a technology that requires scale up. Large scale up, which has traditionally been associated with the heavy industries that are emitting carbon. So cement, oil and gas, steel, these require large plants, a lot of large capital investment. And so that barrier is compounded with what Peter just mentioned by a small market. So you have two opposing forces that create this barrier, okay? And so that's really the biggest challenge. How do you convince investors to make $1 billion capital investment as what's been made or required for things like carbon engineering and Climeworks, okay, against a market that is kind of in the millions per year? It's getting there. I think there's more and more interest from the heavy engineering side, from the companies that have the capital to really make an impact here on the engineering side, and from the market. And I think it's starting to converge. And that's really what we need. We need to bring in those that have the capital to put the steel in the ground, those that have the experience in heavy industry to really want to work in carbon removal. Okay, so that needs to push toward carbon removal while the market starts to grow to start closing this gap. So really, I look at it from a technical side. And we need to get this technical muscle that's existed for years, that's built large plants, that knows how to remove carbon, to really start moving toward the carbon removal industry.
And echoing some of the comments from Dr. Friedman earlier, investing in innovation is never a bad choice. It more than makes up for itself. Actually, Dante, continuing with you for a second, I noticed that Sea Change recently received grant funding from the company in the organization in Singapore, Temasek. Could you speak to that? Could you speak to how an organization like that might unlock some of the potential for an early stage company such as yourself?
I think that the biggest impact that has is it allows us to build a pilot plant and allows us to demonstrate at significant scale what our process can do. And that's really, very simply put, that's what a company like an organization like Temasek will do for us. Stripe was mentioned. An organization like Stripe coming in and looking to be basically an initial buyer of carbon from a pilot plant to facilitate the construction of that pilot plant. That's another big help for companies looking to get out there, because that diversifies the sources that new companies, fledgling companies can use to really demonstrate their product. And that really then will call in the bigger heavy hitters, demonstrating a pilot plant. And it's something, again, the technology and the technical know-how I don't think is new. The technical know-how is all there. It's just getting the resources behind that technical know-how and motivating that technical know-how to kind of enter in the foray a little earlier than they might be used to, or that they might be comfortable with. Okay, so bringing people from the other side, entrepreneurs and investors are happy jumping into something that's not completely de-risked.
Yep.
That's their excitement. The steel industry, the oil and gas industry, the cement industry are going to wait until it's working perfectly almost. So it's kind of nudging that area more toward picking something up that's a little, that might have a little bit of de-risking. And that's where Stripe, Temasek, private foundations can help make an impact by saying, we will help you build a pilot plant.
Great. And there's a question from the audience about what needs to happen to increase buyer side participation for carbon removal. Peter, we'll get back to that in a second, but Rahul, contrasting the role of first buyers, and would really like to unpack your experience with the first X Prize competition for carbon, what that meant for the company, and how that provided a incentive or goal to work toward.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So, and I'll speak to this more from not having been involved since the earliest days, but reflecting with the team on this over the last year. So there's two real programs that were seminal to Carbon Built's evolution as a company. First was certainly X Prize, and it was through the X Prize competition that the technology matured from thimble scale in the lab to 10th scale pilot demonstration. And this is not a quick process, right? It was a 5.5 year process, really. But the thing it added that you rarely get out of a university driven program by itself, and frankly you also don't get just with government funded programs, because the other big program that kind of helped to drive our evolution was progressively larger grants from the Department of Energy, right? Mm-hmm. But there's something about a competition and a sort of either winner take all, or really you don't, if you're not at the top in this next round, you're out, to motivate a team to come together and do whatever it takes to achieve an objective over a very specific and externally mandated timeframe. And these are things that we do as entrepreneurs, but is not normally the way university programs work. And this, our entry into X Prize, all our work with DOE, was all while the work was being done at UCLA. So it provided a huge forcing function for the energy level, and that actually motivated as well others who had been philanthropic donors to contribute. So it wasn't just the team, but actually motivating the ecosystem of the community to help out. So was absolutely critical. It's certainly not the only way to get a company off the ground. There's many of those, but for Carbon Built, those two things were critical, and certainly the X Prize played a huge role in that.
Thank you. Thank you. So now a question for Peter from Sharon Gillette. What needs to happen to increase the buyer side participation for carbon removal, do you think?
So interestingly, a lot of companies make a net zero commitment. I think it's like 68% of the market cap in the US has made a net zero commitment now, which is awesome. It's amazing that companies are doing that. And that means then first and foremost, measuring what the footprint is. Second, focusing on reductions and getting reductions down. And then third is the question of then, okay, well, for the remainder, what do you do? Do you buy offsets? Do you buy nature-based offsets? Do you buy engineered removals, et cetera? And I think because companies have made a net zero commitment, then they, to some extent, get forced into buying these sort of fraudulent nature-based offsets that are super low priced, because that's what's reasonable to afford, and they didn't really budget for the full cost. And so if you were to look at the rate of fraud or other things going on in the nature-based offset regime and sort of price it up, it would be very expensive, and it would be about the same cost as the engineered removals. And so I think companies kind of get surprised by that as they get deeper into the space after making a net zero commitment. And interestingly, Stripe took a very different approach here, as has Shopify to some extent, where Stripe said, look, we're not going to try to be net zero. We're just going to invest by buying at whatever price engineered removals that are high quality, that are definitively going to solve the problem and come down the cost curve. And so they took a slightly different, they put a different stake in the ground, right? They put a different stake in the ground that we're going to help this industry get started and be part of the long-term solution, as opposed to hitting a shorter-term net zero commitment that may actually back us into a corner long-term where we don't have the supply of engineered removals that we need. And I think that is the sort of level of understanding and depth of understanding about the space and what needs to happen in the industry that we need more buyers to kind of learn or grow into over time. And so anyways, I think that's the gap, is we need the buyer side to kind of catch up in understanding what's actually happening when they purchase an offset, and how the industry needs to grow and how they can best support that with long-term offtakes at the actual price of carbon removal today.
Great.
And JJ, if you don't mind, I'll just to build
Please.
on Peter's comment, certainly agree with a lot of what he said, but just to pull in kind of something Dante said earlier. I mean, the other thing that we really noticed and you know, it's been different about Stripe's approach is that for new solutions, right, that have not had the opportunity to go through full certification, verification, you know, because we don't have plants up and the first pilots up and running, for example, or the first plants, you know, having the judgment to say, you know, even though you're not there yet, like we can look at preliminary LCAs, and we've got a team that can interpret that internally and make judgments about what we want to bet on, and then, you know, those teams you're investing in can use that, you know, use those first plants to then go get verified, for example, right? And and I think that's going to be critical. It's going to be critical to getting more folks doing more things in the space, because you can't, if you put all the requirements that we know need to be there, right, on the first pilot plants and first plants, you end up in this chicken and egg, you know, and whoever gets out the gate with something verified first ends up, even if they're not the most optimal solution, ends up taking it because we haven't allowed those, you know, 1,000 flowers to bloom. So.
I would also just add briefly that I think the sophisticated buyers are catching on to the fact that the engineered high quality carbon removals are extremely capacity constrained and supply constrained. And so actually there's a whole set of buyers now that are shifting from nature-based to engineered removals in some proportion of their portfolio, as Stripe, Shopify, Microsoft, et cetera, did last year. And the really sophisticated buyers now, those three and others, are starting to now say, oh, the capacity is going to be really constrained as everyone moves into this space. I should go buy out all the capacity that I need through 2025, 2030, because I'm going to go lock up that capacity, because otherwise there's going to be no capacity available for me. And it kind of means that everyone's going to be a sitting duck with these nature-based offsets that are over time getting more and more exposed as not really actually removing the carbon. They may have other benefits, which are really important, but from a carbon basis, not actually solving the challenge. So it may be that a whole bunch of buyers may also get locked out. So there's a little bit of a rush, I think, that needs to happen to like buy out the capacity and create the revenue stream that allows the investment to create the capacity that we need.
Yeah, great. One more question for Dante, and then we'll get to some of the audience questions. I want to leave enough time for that. Dante, could you speak to the role of accelerators in the space? How to, you know, organizations that can provide that forcing function, so to speak, to get a company to develop maybe further along than they might have otherwise?
I think that broadly speaking, you can think about, I would say from my perspective, we sit down and we think, what do we need to do to get to X, you know, grams of CO2 removed, X kilograms of CO2 removed per day, 10X, 100X, 1000X, okay? And then we look at really the jobs that are associated with that, and we break this down into basically cost. And so what we can do is we can come up with certain, I guess, what certain levels of investment will give us, okay, in getting toward those goals, okay? And that is really kind of where we say, okay, well, here's how a certain investment will accelerate our process. Okay, so for example, if we need to do, Rahul mentioned the, you know, rules and regulations around carbon removal. If we need to, for our particular process, look at where our plants have to go with respect to shorelines, with respect to regulations, Okay, if we put a certain investment into studying that, right, that's going to accelerate every single plant we need from the, from the 50 kilograms up to the 50, 5,000 kilograms. Okay, so when you think about a small investment, that accelerates everything because now we don't have to do it at every stop. Okay, and that's a pretty small, investment. It's not asking for $100 million to build a, tons per day plant. All right, so I think from when we think about accelerators, that's really kind of what we focus on as an early stage company. Okay, what can we do to help the plants we need to build at every single scale? What can we do in one shot to do that? Okay,
Great.
and then we start focusing on, okay, what's the capital for the small plant as opposed to the larger plants, because that's certainly a different methodology to support that. So it's really looking at kind of a very focused investments that can impact every scale of new development.
Got it. Question. Thank you, Dante. So a question came in from Klaus Felby from Novo Nordisk. Flat out, do we have the tools, programs, infrastructures, and policies in place for this ecosystem? What I kind of read that as is, what can encourage more entrepreneurs to come into the space? Anybody, feel free to chime in.
I think the most important thing to realize, or to help people realize, is that there's no like big body of people who are like solving this problem. It's an extremely small group of people. Like everyone, there was the Direct Air Capture Summit in Zurich 2 weeks ago. We had a dinner exactly 2 weeks ago, Tuesday night, and every single company, I think, in the direct air capture space, every single direct air capture company, every single storage company that I know of, was around a table, 2 tables in Zurich, just 20 people. Like, there's probably maybe double that in the ecosystem, but it is ridiculously small. And I think that there's this, I love what Greta Thunberg has done in like highlighting the importance of climate change, but she said something interesting recently that I think highlights a key mentality that we have to change, which is, she said, it's not my job to come up with a solution, it's my job to protest for the change. And like, that's fine for a child, right? And she's incredible, but that can't be the mentality that we all have. We have to have the mentality that we have agency on this, and that there's no one else, there's no like white knight who's going to solve it. Like, we have to solve this, and it's everyone in this room, and it's the people, who are just coming out of college today. Like, we need more people working in this space. It's very, very, very small community. So I think breaking through this mentality of like, it's not our responsibility to protest it, it's actually our responsibility to solve it, I think is really important. And how can we promote that mentality of agency?
Rahul, Dante?
I'll add one thing here. So, Peter mentioned the small space. I think really you need to get the people that need to enter this space and that really need to put the muscle behind it, at least in my opinion, are those that have, again, I said this before, those that have the engineering knowledge and know about scale. Okay. And so, yes, it's going to be I speak to the oil and gas industry because that's where I was trained in. That's where I have experience from. I could go to any oil and gas company and I have the technical people to really boost any of these problems from an engineering design standpoint. It's enticing either those individuals or those companies to put their muscle behind it before they typically would. Okay, and to be quite honest, I don't know. I don't know how. Maybe someone else has an idea of how to do that. I mean, governments certainly can't force it. It just won't work. That's what needs to happen. Getting those types of people in there, okay, to really kind of spur things along. Maybe it's basically just the promise of a shorter cost curve, buying down the cost curve. Maybe that would be it. Maybe some acceptance of, yes, there'll be losses early on, all right, but this is a longer term gain, okay, and you can't put a price on kind of cleaning up the planet. So that's, I think, in my mind, I wish there would be more focus on getting those people involved. How do you get that side involved? Because I think you can get investors involved easier than that side, but that side needs to get involved. Both from with either of those companies participating directly or people with that type of talent coming in and working for companies that are engineering carbon removal. So either recruiting talent or partnerships. So that has to happen.
Great.
Just
Thank
to build on Dante's point, I would say, again, sort of reflecting back on a number of startups, right, all focused on climate, all ultimately having to connect new ideas and innovation with large scale, heavy industry or heavy industrial operations. I mean, it's easy to start a company today. What's hard is starting a company where and growing a culture where you can get these two things to, these two cultures and two types of personalities. Because, let's be clear, right? The folks that have spent generally 10, 20, 25 years working for large industry, I mean, it's rare that you find the right sort of cultural fit personality with a startup. But when you can marry those together and create an environment that allows, the innovators and the risk takers to pull in, lessons learned and the sort of discipline you need for scale up, right? That's the magic, and it's not easy. But I think that those are the companies that are gonna win. And in order to do this, we just need more, right? More of that. The good news is today, because of the investment and the financing, it's easier today to convince someone who spent 15 years in process engineering at an oil company or at a consultancy or what have you to come make the leap, right? Because you've raised in your Series A round enough financing to support the team for a couple of years, right? So that helps.
Okay. Thank you. And so I'm getting some, looks like we are at time for our session today. I would be actually remiss in my duty with Air Miners if I didn't mention that Air Miners has a Launchpad program for some of the early stage startups. Just added a link in the chat here. If there are early stage entrepreneurs who are interested in collaborating with other entrepreneurs in a Air Miners forum, that is a great 6-week free program to apply to and attend. We are in the midst of doing our second batch and aim to do a third batch in Q1 of 2022. So feel free to apply and go from there. Otherwise, again, thank you, Rahul. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Dante. And once again, thank you to the State of Green and to the Innovation Center of Denmark in Silicon Valley. And with that, I'm going to cede the floor to Peter Miner of Carbon 180. Hello, Peter. And to talk about the role of innovation in carbon removal. So thank you so much.
Awesome. Thank you, Jason. It's good to be here with everybody. My name's Peter. I'm Director of Science and Innovation at Carbon 180. And I'm here to talk about the next step beyond entrepreneurship, which is R&D. So if entrepreneurship is going to be the engine that pulls us out of the depths of climate change, then R&D is the fuel that will enable it all to happen. So there have been, as you just heard, a tremendous amount of accomplishments in the last few years by startups, including record-breaking deployments. But there's no question about it. We're going to need more innovation and better technology to actually reach the cost and scale that we need for carbon removal to make a material impact on climate change. For that reason, I'm excited to be here with two panelists who have deep experience in accelerating the path from research to full-scale deployments. So the first is Mark, and Mark is the director for the Division of Emissions Controls and Carbon Capture, Utilization and Storage, Research and Development at the Department of Energy, DOE. He's responsible for planning, management, administration of the division's R&D portfolio. In the role, he leads a team of scientists and engineers that are collaborating and working domestically and internationally with industry, national labs, and universities on developing and transforming CCUS and carbon dioxide removal technologies. So prior to his position Mark was serving as DOE's Carbon Capture Program Manager and Fuels Program Manager. So Mark, if you'd like to, can you take a few minutes to just introduce yourself and what you work on at DOE?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Peter, for the introduction. And as Peter mentioned, I'm at the Department of Energy, and the overall mission at DOE is to ensure America's security and prosperity, really addressing the energy, environmental, and we do have our work on the nuclear side as well. But I'm mostly here on the energy environmental side. Really looking to spawn that creativity and innovation in the science and tech space, looking at a whole broad suite of technologies. But as Peter mentioned, my focus is on the CCUS and CDR removal. We've made some great investments in these areas in the past, and it's great to see companies like Carbon Built and others moving forward and participating today. And again, we have the depth and breadth of the national lab bodies here within DOE itself that bring a lot of skill sets and capabilities. So just excited to be here and looking forward to the discussion.
Thanks so much for being here, Mark. Next up, we also have Christian, who is the director and co-chair of the Innovation Fund Denmark. In 2019, Christian led the review of the Danish innovation system, peer review of the Danish R&I system, 10 steps and a leap forward, taking Danish innovation to the next level. He's a global expert on economic competitiveness and strategy, and recently returned to Harvard Business School, where he serves as a faculty member and principal associate professor in the Michael Porter's Institute of Strategy and Competitiveness. He also chairs the advisory board of the TCI Network and the scientific advisory board of Orchestra, the Basque Institute for Competitiveness, and is a member of the Senior Economic Advisory Board of PIF, Saudi Arabia's Sovereign Wealth Fund. Thanks for being here, Christian. Would love for you to take a few minutes to introduce yourself and talk about what you work on.
Thank you so much, Peter. Really enjoyed already listening to the discussion at this event, and very happy to share the stage here with Mark. As you already heard from Peter's introduction, I know very little about carbon capture, uses, and storage. I hope to be able to contribute a little bit on our thinking, how we at Innovation Fund Denmark are trying to help with the innovation that will be required to come up with the right solutions and actually bring them to market in this space as in others. So Innovation Fund Denmark is the key innovation agency of the Danish government. We invest in people just like the ones that you just saw on the screen in the panel before, entrepreneurs that are trying to use science and innovation to develop new solutions, scientists that maybe have come out across a new technology or a new finding in their work that they want to bring to market. So we help those. We also help consortia of companies and universities in things that we call grand challenges, which require a little bit more of a collaboration. And our newest program, which I think is most connected to today's discussion, are the intermissions, which is an effort in 4 areas to really provide the innovation engine towards addressing the climate neutrality challenge that the Danish government put out. We're investing every year about $300 million US. So it's more kind of leverage money. We're trying to get others to invest in things. We're doing this in the form of grants. The Danish government has other tools that provides equity finance. We kind of give away the money. Our return comes in the jobs and in the solution to the societal challenges that are ahead of us. So looking forward to the discussion. Thanks, Peter.
I love it. Thank you so much for being here, Christian. All right, friends, let's get into it. The first topic area I want to talk about is investment and prioritization strategies. So especially in carbon removal, we generally know where we're trying to go. We know what the end goals are, but there's a big question of which path we take. There are quite a few divergent paths that exist today. And to be successful at this, we need to invest in carbon removal in a clever and impactful way that maximizes the value of the investments that we can make and will also reach our climate goals in mind. So Mark, to you first, what do you think is the smartest way of investing in your opinion? How should we be thinking about building portfolios and allocating the dollars that we have?
Yeah, so thanks, Peter. So I think a couple different ways we can think about that type of question. One is, and one of the things that we do at DOE quite often is looking at ways that we can be collaborative And that's not just, DOE collaborating with other partners, but it's also having our researchers be collaborative as well, working and pulling together teams and responding in that way. When it's really looking at carbon removal, and we're thinking about the different approaches and investments, a lot of that's going to depend upon the scale and the priorities for those investments. So, for example, if you're looking at early stage R&D, those investments and the approaches that you're going to take will be very different compared to the decisions that you're looking to make when you're investing in field tests, demonstrations, or commercial deployment. So I think for a lot of these latter stage efforts, it's really about thinking through all the issues and what are the questions. So when you're thinking about that strategy and ways to invest, what are the key questions? Oftentimes, we get so focused on technology sometimes, and at DOE, that's, one of our key things. But when you're really starting to think about commercial scale or pilot scale type tests, it starts moving beyond the technology. So when we're thinking in our strategies in that way, it's how do you build community support for projects? What's the decision-making process around the projects? Who benefits? What are the market conditions and the business cases, and what roles can we play in say, helping to develop those cases or those business opportunities? So I think it's really asking a lot of questions and really focusing on what are you trying to achieve by the R&D investments that you're making. Again, early stage R&D will be very different than when you're looking at those field scale type projects. So it's really about asking those questions and trying to maximize that impact.
On the topic of investment and project strategy, the Danish government has launched a green research strategy with 4 R&D missions, one of them being CCUS. And given Innovation Fund Denmark the task of bringing these missions alive and funding them, Christian, what is the idea behind the technology roadmap and Inno-mission partnership approach that you've chosen? How do you find that these mission-driven communities will look like, and will be relevant for the US communities to engage with them, given that the problem is, by all definitions, an international one?
Absolutely. And, I think we're coming specifically to how we can engage between the US and Denmark also a little bit later on in the discussion. But I think why this different approach, and it really is a different approach. So we're also experimenting a little bit with new policy instruments here. I think Julio actually in his presentation early on put it extremely well. I think we basically have a lot of the technologies that we're requiring. However, we need to bring the cost dramatically down, and we need to move from individual technological solution to kind of an ecosystem, value chains, and markets that function. And so that was the idea with the Innomissions, to not just give money to one specific research effort and say, here's a specific technological problem that needs to be solved, but there is a sequence of steps that will need to be taken in order to arrive at the goals that we have for 2035 and 2050 in terms of carbon removal. And so we're investing sort of in the connecting tissue that is able to identify the right choices, the right research projects, and then learn from the results to kind of take the next step and move us closer to the ultimate goal. That's sort of the idea behind that. We first asked actually for a roadmap. What's the situation, and what do you see as the steps that are out there? And then we've been asking, or we're actually at the moment asking people to kind of develop proposals for partnerships that will govern this process. So they will get the money. And in the sense you asked about the investment decisions, we've almost outsourced that. We've said, we want to give money to partnerships that are open and comprehensive enough to make the right choices in moving forward and kind of getting us closer to the goal in this particular mission area.
You mentioned that one of the goals is to drive down costs, and that does feel like a really critical goal, given that adoption is going to be directly proportional to what cost we can eventually achieve. And so one of the questions I've been thinking a lot about lately is, from a funder's perspective, how do you balance deploying and orchestrating R&D investments and creating new technologies that could be step functions and capability that will eventually bring down costs, versus putting money into existing technologies that are in the market and trying to bring them down the cost curve? How do you allocate in those two different perspectives? And I actually would love to hear from both of you on this. So maybe Mark, do you want to start us off?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Peter. So yeah, that's always a common question that we see, and being a DOE and a government funding agency, sometimes that's driven by the policies that you have within the department itself. But thinking of this, broader beyond that government side, and you need both, and just starting with the deployment side of it and looking at the larger scale projects and moving those forward, it's really de-risking those projects, seeing what and getting them out there, testing the technologies, seeing what the business models look like, and then taking the learnings from those first of a kind projects, and how does that then influence the R&D that you're looking to make investments in. And that works two ways. One is working on investments to improve those existing technologies to help drive down the costs, along with the learning by doing that you get coming down the cost curve. But then two, where are the opportunities for real breakthroughs and innovations to kind of be more disruptive and to really kind of shift the way things might occur. So I think it's really capturing those learnings from those first of a kind projects and bringing that into your R&D development capabilities, and really trying to leverage off of those and having that interaction between the two types of efforts.
Christian, anything else to add?
Yeah, no. So, I mean, again, in some sense, we're trying to push the question back to the people that apply for funding in these partnerships. We want them to convince us about what their position is and where they, how they want to allocate the money that's available to them on these two fields. That's the general answer. I would say the specific one is that we're trying to push more towards the, closer to market, bringing it into real action area, partly also because I think innovation agencies traditionally are very focused on the research arm, and we're working with those people, the scientists, also in the companies that do that. And that's fine and well, but we want to have impact. We need impact. And that, I think, will only happen if we kind of strengthen that bridge towards real adoption of these new technologies. So I think that's something that we're looking specifically on, that people don't forget that and think, oh, if we have the great research and science, we're done. We're not. We need more.
And sorry, maybe just one more comment on that, and it's something that I think was referenced earlier, and it's the issue of consistent funding. That when you are making these investments, if you're making investments on those early stage technologies, do you have a pathway forward for those to go through the pilot scale test to make sure that they're validated, so that when you do have investors who are looking to make bigger investments, whether that's venture capital or private funds, that those technologies are validated. So I think that consistency in that funding is really important through that development cycle.
And do you both think that funding ecosystem through the development cycle exists today for CDR, or are there gaps that need to be filled?
Yeah, I think it's it's for us in the Department of Energy, it's a relatively new area that we're starting to look on. For example, like we've had investments in carbon removal in the past, and have been able to leverage off of some of the previous work that we've been doing. But in our FY22 budget, that was the first year where we actually had a line that said carbon dioxide removal. So I think we're starting to take steps in that direction to move it to more of that consistent funding, and to make it a little bit easier for those on the outside to understand, okay, well, how is DOE approaching their investments, and what does that look like, and what are the priorities that they're engaging on.
And Mark, I can't tell you how big of a deal it was to have that line item in the budget. We were very excited at Carbon 180 because we're nerds like that. But yeah, sorry, Christian, please. I want to hear from you too.
No worries. And I just want to echo what Mark says. I think this is also for the agencies a learning journey, on how we set this up. I do think, there's clearly more capital flowing into this area also on the research, and the new investment by the funding by the Novo Nordisk Foundation for the center in Aarhus was mentioned already. I mean, they're spending at least the same amount of money that we're going to spend on the missions, just on this one effort. But I think what we still need to do more is sort of the orchestration. There are lots of things going on, here in Europe by the Commission, by the Danish government, by many other players. And we need to make sure that we even if we act independently, that we kind of see how this all fits together. And that's where I think we hope to play a little bit of a role in that context, but there's much more to do.
Christian, that's a perfect segue. I want to hear more about exactly that, because I think what we heard in the first panel was 3 successful, hopefully successful so far, startup journeys. 2 of them spun out of UCLA. And I think what's interesting to me is that that's an example of these startup ecosystems that have popped up, usually around universities or national labs, where really interesting new technologies are coming out and getting commercialized. But it's important that all the pieces are there for that whole pipeline to exist and to be successful, right? You need the research, you need startup companies, you need accelerators, you need capital. So, Christian, I'm curious to hear more about how you're thinking about that and how that can be built for carbon removal.
Yeah, so I think this is absolutely central for our success. I think it's not going to be investing in individual scientists or companies or individual technologies. It's creating these ecosystems. For Innovation Fund Denmark, and I think for most innovation agencies, this is a little bit a new area. We're used to fund in it, maybe a consortium, but this is a much more open structure. You mentioned in my background that I chair kind of a global network of people that work on clusters. And I think there's a lot of similarity here that people come together. It's not a formal structure, but there's something here to do. And you need some intermediaries to kind of keep those networks operating and acting with a common strategy. We are ready to invest in that. So I think there is some money that we have in these calls for capacity building. We are also ready to do more, but quite frankly, we need to learn a little bit from the partnerships that are now building on how best to do that. Denmark has quite a number of different institutions. They actually have very strong cluster organizations, including in energy. They also have what's called climate partnerships, where the leading companies in that area are also represented. So we sort of need to figure out what is really needed in order to not just create another entity, but make sure that the right type of dialogue is happening and the right type of decisions can be facilitated.
Quick follow-up question. This is going to be a long-term process to build the right ecosystems to really make this an effective pathway. What are the early steps that you think Denmark should be making, the US should be making? Yeah, what is the low-hanging fruit here that we can tap into?
That's actually not an easy question. I mean, I guess our thinking was, work on the roadmap and work on the institutional structure. That's not a low-hanging fruit, and that's not making a difference in the short term. So I do think we need to have some of these things as well. So, in that context, we're particularly happy about this investment in Aarhus, which is really a lighthouse symbol in this particular space. But let me more say what I'm worried about. What I'm worried about is, and what we really need to avoid is, particularly for Denmark, our political goal is reducing carbon emissions for Denmark. And in the global context, that of course is almost irrelevant, pretty much irrelevant. But Danish technology is not irrelevant in addressing our carbon goals globally. And so I think getting the right balance between our domestic political goals and the international impact is really important. And again, this is why the collaboration with the US is really important for us, I think, to create that type of leverage effect.
Very well said. Mark, how about you? DOE has historically been a great conveyor and bringer together of ecosystems. Any thoughts on this?
Yeah, so I think one of the key things is communication and engagement amongst these entities is absolutely critical. Yeah, and I'll go back to some of my experience on the carbon capture and storage side. Typically, and again, DOE historically is R&D investment, technology development, but we had our capture program. They would have their annual meeting. We would have our storage program annual meeting. Well, let's get them all together and start talking to each other. And it was actually very fascinating to see the discussions that were taking place on the sidelines of those conversations, because you had capture folks talking to the storage and being, here's what we're doing. How does that align with, the opportunities that are on the storage side? And so I think it's actually one of the first, just to go back to your first question on it, was what are some of the first steps that you can take? I think it's just actually bringing those communities together and just having a discussion is really critical. That way you start getting the ideas flowing and understanding what are the challenges, what are the opportunities, and what are the needs. Like, for example, if I'm a researcher and I'm looking to, and I have a great idea, but how do I go about accessing, say, that startup funding or that capital to move my technology forward? What are they looking to see in terms of my technical progress to make those investments? So I think it's really just bringing those communities together and having that discussion and engagement.
And Mark, DOE has a long history of supporting innovation across the board, not just in CCUS and carbon removal, but also renewables and nuclear and yeah, there's a lot of different areas. Do you think that there are examples in DOE's past where community building and ecosystem building efforts have been very successful that we could bring some of those learnings over into carbon removal?
So yeah, I think there are opportunities, and if you look back at the DOE history on like large scale projects, some people will say that's a very checkered past, but I think there's a lot of learnings though that come from that, as whether those are successes or in minds of whether those were failures or not, that's for others to judge and decide. But I think there's historically things that the DOE has worked on, for example, acid rain removal acid rain challenges in the 80s, and looking at NOx and SOx removal, the financial crises in the 2000s and some of those efforts. So I think it's what are the things that we can do better as at the department in helping create those ecosystems, and what are some of the things that we learned from that past. And I think one of the key things is it's not always about the technology at that point. It's really trying to understand the regulatory side, the financial side, making sure you have good projects to invest in, understanding the community and EJ issues as well, making sure there's support for the projects. And then also making sure that those projects are going to be durable beyond a certain time period as well. So I think it's just trying to, again, I keep going back to these questions, but I really think it's about asking the right questions to make sure that we're framing things in an appropriate manner to build these ecosystems. And then the other part is, I've mentioned it previously, but that communication and engagement.
So great. Last question in this section. We have limited resources and a big goal that we need to get to eventually, gigaton scale carbon removal. How should we think about overlaying both public resources and money with private resources and money? What is the ideal setup for that? What should it look like? Christian, do you want to get us started?
Yeah, I mean, I am quite optimistic that actually medium term, the money is not going to be the problem. I think there is a lot of capital in principle that's ready to invest. So I think we as government players, I think need to make sure that we set direction. A lot of these missions are about directionality, and then make sure that at the steps where it's possible to kind of de-risk and so on. But I see our funding almost, as a signaling device where we see, this is going to be a medium to long-term priority of the government. We're going to stick to that. We as Innovation Fund don't do the market creation, we don't do the regulation, but we're part of the political mechanism that kind of needs to see that entirety together. And I think that's where we can play a role. We can also, reflecting on our earlier discussion, invest in this kind of connectivity, in the intermediaries that make sure that there is coordination, there is a common sense of where we're going. And then we can really kind of draw on the entrepreneurs and the researchers kind of to do what they do best, build businesses and do their research within that context and with a common direction.
Yeah, maybe just to add to that, I agree with many of the points that Christian was making. And, typically from the government funding perspective, when you're looking at making investments, it's how does this achieve some type of common or societal goal or objective? But then when you're looking at, say, private funding, it's delivering a societal service or need, but it's also looking at making that return on the investment as well for those companies. So I think just recognizing those two different perspectives, and then understanding what the strengths are that each of those bring to the table, and how they can help build that ecosystem or those market conditions, I think is really the critical step in this, is understanding what are those strengths and how can they be leveraged off each other to make advancements in this space.
Yeah, those are such great points. Like, I think the public capital, based on what you're saying, has this amazing opportunity to be catalytic, to unlock other dollars and demonstrate to society, to markets, that this is something that is real. And hopefully that should lead to a lot more engagement and hopefully a lot more investment. So that's fantastic. And then finishing us up, let's talk a bit more about the Danish-US partnership opportunities and what we could do collaboratively on carbon removal, both regarding research, but also demonstration projects. So Mark, starting with you, the DOE and Denmark recently signed an MOU about energy research that also mentions carbon removal. Do you see this agreement as an important platform for further US-Danish collaboration going forward? What are you excited about?
Oh, yes, absolutely. I mean, well, I always take a bit of a hands-off approach sometimes, that, if you get people in a room to collaborate, you don't necessarily need like agreements, but agreements are fantastic though, because they help formalize things, they provide a structure, and they provide a focus and emphasis that's often lacking sometimes when these things kind of are just growing organically. So from that perspective, like this is great to have this agreement in place. It's always the next steps, from what we've seen in these agreements that are critical, and it's how do we engage and leverage and provide dedicated resources to make sure that we're leveraging the agreement and the capabilities with each other. And that takes time. These things don't, necessarily crop up, in a month or 2 months. It takes time to build the relationships, focus on what are the priorities within each country, what are the skill sets and capabilities, and what are the key interests or goals, and how can we start developing collaborative projects around this area to leverage the best of both countries to help move forward and achieve some common goals and objectives. So, but it's exciting to have the agreement in place, and look forward to doing some of the implementation on it.
That's great. And Christian, Innovation Fund Denmark is also a signing partner on this agreement. Do you see any potential for linking the work you're doing with the InnoMission partnership on carbon removal to upcoming activities under this MOU?
Oh, absolutely. I think the door is wide open, and I already saw in the chat that one of the companies that in Denmark is engaged in drafting one of the applications said the Innovation Fund is very actively encouraging foreign participation. And that's absolutely true. But I also want to say, the door is not closed when these applications have been submitted, which will be relatively soon. So I think if you're not already in the process, that might be too late. But the way that we've designed that, and the ambition is really that these are open partnerships where you can kind of connect later on. And we'll also push our Danish InnoMission partnerships to consistently look outside, not just for markets, but also for partners in terms of technology. The Innovation Fund has different funding instruments as well, where they are needed to do this. And, I'm sure with all our colleagues in the US, we'll also kind of put more to the details to that on the MOU. But there is a toolkit that's ready. So if you're interested, reach out to your colleagues in Denmark or directly to us, and we can look for what the most appropriate way is to bring the two systems together.
Last question. I think it's very easy to think about climate change in a national context because we will feel it directly in a national context, but it really is a global problem. And there's a big opportunity in my mind for countries like Denmark and the US to come together in joint action to demonstrate that there is a common way forward, that there is a collective set of actions that can show others what is the right approach and how we can move forward the right way. And so I'm curious, do you think there are opportunities in this partnership for joint action, joint calls, and opening of national programs that include international partners that can spur more carbon removal innovation? And I know like we're still in the early days of this, and so you don't have to give any concrete ideas, but what do you think could happen? Like what is the best case scenario here, and what should we strive for as an international community?
Yeah, so I'll take the first crack at it, and I'm curious to hear Christian's thoughts as well. I think the great news is that there is actually work and opportunities that we can leverage off of, and I'm going to cite a couple examples that we have through the Department of Energy, where we're already engaging with partners in Denmark and internationally, and it's through a past effort through the Aeronets on ACT, the Accelerating CCS Technologies Initiative. And we've been coordinating and collaborating with multiple European partners. Actually, Canada, Emissions Reduction Alberta from the provincial government in Canada had joined, the Department of Science and Technology in India. And then we're working with the Danish Energy Agency as well. And it's a way to pull funding together and to focus on collaborative projects, leveraging resources and capabilities. So, so there are some opportunities that we can leverage off of. And I know the European countries are going through the clean energy transition partnerships right now as well, and getting those stood up. So I think those might be some opportunities in the future that can help play a role. And then finally, and this is still in planning stages, but under mission innovation, there's some internal planning looking at doing some carbon dioxide removal work as part of mission innovation as well. So I think looking at those opportunities, I think it's wide open, but the good news is I think there's a lot of opportunities that we can leverage from our past work.
Yeah, no, totally agree with Mark. And obviously, I'm the first foreigner on the board of the Danish Innovation Agency, so I can't commit the Danish government to anything. I know that joint calls are sometimes a little bit complicated. My message would be, don't wait for something like that. It might happen. I mean, we have money at the Innovation Fund. We're just writing our new international strategy, so it's quite possible to do something jointly. But as Mark said, I mean, I think there are many ways to do this. So if you have an idea where you think, a partnership between a US and a Danish partner would really make a difference, and this would be good, approach us. I'm sure approach the colleagues at DOE, and we'll find the right way to kind of support this. I think there are the instruments ready, and the entrepreneurs don't need to kind of figure out which one of the 25 programs might be the best one just for them. I think we can help them do that job.
Well, I'm very excited to see what gets built. Christian, Mark, this has been such a great conversation. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you. Pleasure.
Next up, I'm happy to be able to introduce my colleague, Rory Jacobson, who is going to lead a discussion on carbon removal policy. National governments are really the only organizations who can credibly write big enough checks to stimulate R&D and market adoption, but also set the right standards around quality and equitable deployment. So getting policy right is the biggest lever that I think that we have for building a robust carbon removal industry. Rory himself is the Deputy Director of Policy at Carbon 180, which is a DC-based NGO on a mission to build a world that removes more carbon than it emits. He previously worked at the Natural Resources Defense Council, researching near-term federal policies to incentivize the deployment of carbon removal approaches. Before that, he was a graduate student at Yale, where he advised the Special Presidential Envoy for Climate with John Kerry on myriad of climate and energy issues. He's also consulted for several organizations working on carbon removal, including the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority, the World Resources Institute, and the Energy Futures Initiative. Rory, I'm excited to pass it over to you.
Thank you so much, Peter, for the kind introduction. And yeah, I guess it's apparent that I focused a little bit too much on carbon removal policy in my career. But before we kick off this last section that is really, again, focused on carbon removal policy, I just wanted to thank the Innovation Center of Denmark, the State of Green, and the Danish Energy Agency again for hosting us today. And I'm really excited in this panel to particularly have a dialogue with two brilliant climate policy minds about the role of carbon removal and potential collaborations between the United States and Denmark particularly. And so in this panel, I'm joined by Matt Baker, who is Deputy Secretary of Energy at the California Natural Resources Agency, and Anders Hoffman, who is Deputy Permanent Secretary at the Ministry for Climate, Energy, and Utilities. And so I will let each of them introduce themselves for a couple of minutes and talk about their role, and particularly how their roles intersect with carbon dioxide removal and carbon capture, utilization, and storage. Maybe Matt, we can start with you if that's okay.
Sure. Thank you, Rory. My name is Matt Baker. I'm the Deputy Secretary for Energy at the California Natural Resources Center or Agency. Our agency is comprised of 43 departments, boards, and commissions with over 25,000 employees. And if it has to do with water, lands, energy, hazards, biodiversity, it's in one of our departments, boards, commissions, or offices. I would also just say on this particular activity, the engineered carbon removal, our agency really focuses on siting, R&D, piloting and demonstration, community engagement, and we're also a point for interagency coordination on this issue. Thank you. And if I turn it over to Anders.
Sure. Well, thank you. Well, a quick presentation. As Anders Hoffman, I am working in the Danish Ministry of Climate and basically overlooking, well, of course, for this discussion, our carbon removal strategy, but also a lot of the other new technologies and how do we actually get them to scale and how to get them into market. And I'm more than happy to participate in this and have more discussion of what we're actually doing. But back to you, Roy.
Yeah, thank you so much. And maybe, I think that that California and Denmark have very distinct policy landscapes. So maybe Matt, you could talk a bit about, the US policy landscape and particularly even California as it relates to carbon removal. What policies are we working with? Where are we sort of in the deployment chain right now?
So, a lot is happening in California on carbon removal, and I think it's a good thing. I think there are three elements that make California a pretty attractive place for a lot of entrepreneurs to begin to test their technologies here. One is we have like Denmark, we have a pretty aggressive climate regulation regime, and that creates the pull, the demand for these technologies. Secondly, we have a number of robust incentives that creates the push. So the low carbon fuel standard is probably the most important, where we're paying upwards of $150, $200 a ton for carbon that could be removed around in the transportation area. We also have access to the federal tax credit, the 45Q tax credit, which is $50 a ton, which will hopefully be tweaked and expanded in the next budget cycle. And then finally, the California has a long history of oil and gas development. So we have a lot of expertise on the sequestration side here, and we have a very large potential for economic storage of carbon. So with that, I'll kind of pass it along.
Yeah, that's great, Anders. It would be awesome to hear from you a little bit about Denmark's policy landscape.
Well, let me start by going back a bit. I think actually Denmark was quite big on carbon capture, I don't know, 20 years ago, but it was completely shut down for political reasons. I think the political landscape at that time was that the carbon capture was something that just would sort of extend the carbon-based economy and something that we did not want to do because we want to have real change and real sort of moving into renewable energy. So it was basically shut down and you were sort of almost looked upon as what is this guy talking about if you talked about carbon capture? And that changed only like 3 years ago because what happened in Denmark was we had this extremely aggressive climate goal with the 70% reduction in 2030 compared to the 2090. And of course, that really needed us to look at all the tools we had in the box. And we started to look at, well, I mean, we had this idea about carbon capture. What could this be part of the policy mix? And I think we saw that, yes, indeed, it could be part of the policy mix. And all the sort of the bad things that it was attached to in the old days, it was just a way to sort of keep coal in the loop, didn't have to be true. I mean, you could have it much more targeted towards cement, towards our bioplants, where you actually didn't have other technologies available. for the reduction of the carbon emissions. So I think now it was really been 2 years ago, it was something we started to discuss very heavily. Last year, it was very much a central part of the first agreement on climate and energy that was made by almost all parties in Denmark, where we sort of said that, okay, we will allow this in Denmark and we will actually have a subsidy scheme for 16 billion Danish kroner that we will be presenting, and we'll be presenting that actually quite soon within the next couple of weeks. So I think it had really sort of, the pendulum has gone, but this is interesting to, this is really don't do it. And now it's very much sort of a key part of our policies. And if we just put a bit more on what we're actually trying to do just before the summer break, I mean, as California, we have very good grounds. I mean, you can have a lot of carbon in the Danish underground due to special geological formation. So it's a very sort of good place to put it. So we have a very big, also almost all the parties in the Danish parliament again sort of agreed that Denmark should be licensing round for storage of CO2 in the Danish underground. It should be allowed to import and export CO2 with the small sort of thing attached to that, that we don't want to have countries that do not follow aggressive climate policy to dump their CO2 in the Danish underground. So I mean, we should have some political agreement with our neighbors like Germany or Sweden or Norway, some other countries that do have progressive policy. There we can import that and we can put that into the ground. And then thirdly, of course, it needed to be safe and environmental friendly to do that. So we have a lot of analysis being kicked off to make sure that this is happening in a way that do not harm the environment in any other ways. But I think that just to sort of end that, I think the important part for the Danish industries was that it's actually allowed not to import, because that would create the scale that is needed in order to make the storage sort of economic feasible, because it does have quite a lot of scale to it. And then even though we are very progressive, we are still a small market. I think the max potential of capture in Denmark is 9 million tons of CO2. So I mean, I think we need to have some kind of imports to have a huge storage industry built in Denmark. I can get more into details of what's coming, but that was just sort of a quick overview.
No, that's incredibly helpful. And I think that in a lot of ways, you know, the United States has a very similar history with CCUS. And so maybe one thing that would be helpful, I think, to hear from you both on is how policy, you know, can note the distinction between point source carbon capture and storage and things like direct air capture that are actually removals. Do they need different types of policies? Should we have the same policies? Matt, I know, for example, in California, our low carbon fuel standard has a CCS protocol that also covers direct air capture. And then with respect to both of these different technologies, one's a mitigation technology and one is a removal technology, what is the role of public engagement and buy-in for some of these policies?
Well, I'll go first. Yeah, I think there are a couple points that are kind of embedded in this question that are important to unpack. And I think the biggest one that we're struggling with right now is, how do you build social license for either carbon capture, carbon dioxide removal, you know, or the whole package? And I think it's really important to come down from abstractions. So, you know, I think the point that Anders made earlier, that this is not, you know, we're not talking about putting carbon capture on big old coal plants and you know, around electricity and really just capturing everything kind of the way we dealt with criteria pollutants. We're really talking about the stuff that's left over that we really don't have a good answer for. So I think the first point is bring the discussions down from abstractions. In California, what we're looking at is we're really looking short term at a couple of different areas where we think kind of the wind is at our back. There's enormous co-benefits. And they're low cost. And, you know, we're not really distinguishing between point source and carbon dioxide removal, you know, because they kind of require a lot of the same infrastructure. But what we are thinking about is, what are the projects and the applications at the end that have buy-in in California? And so we're looking at places where there are relatively pure streams of CO2 that are just kind of emitted into the atmosphere right now, that we're going to have for some period of time. So let's just capture those, whether it's hydrogen production or ethanol production, you know, and hopefully pretty soon cement. we're also looking at areas where we have other problems that we're trying to solve. The Tahoe National Forest has about 400,000 gigantic piles of wood in it. They're decomposing, they're turning into methane in the best case. In the worst case, they're exploding in wildfires. So are there ways to take that source and turn that into hydrogen and capture the carbon and put that under the ground? Not so much to see it as an important energy source, but really see it as a way to keep those forests from going into the atmosphere as our climate's changing. And then finally, are there places where we can do direct air capture pilots and see how that goes across the state? So, I think the key issue is for us to retreat from abstraction and really talk about it on a project by project basis with engagement of the communities that are right around it, and who can benefit in terms of jobs and reduce criteria pollutants, and work to build both advance the technology and build social acceptance for it.
Just to follow up on that, I think we would tend to have sort of a quite similar approach. I mean, I think we'll have three buckets that we're looking at. I mean, we have the big emitters. I mean, you have a chimney and you have a lot of CO2 coming out of that chimney, and you can use carbon capture to remove that. And I think that would be sort of the key focus of the strategy. And there are very few plants in Denmark that actually have that problem. So it's quite easy to make that quite targeted. Then we have a second bucket, which would be, I mean, we do have a lot of biogas in Denmark, and when they upgrade the biogas to put it into the normal gas, they will actually remove some CO2. Currently we don't use that. I mean, you could capture that also, and there might be some other small facility where you can have sort of much more local carbon capture. And then thirdly, I mean, of course, we are also thinking about direct air capture. I mean, as we see currently, the price is just so high, and the space might be too big, but it's something that's on our radar. And I think maybe just one more distinction that we're making. We're really trying to see, I mean, where do the CO2 come from? I mean, is it bio-based or is it fossil-based? Because we do want to have quite a lot of industry for power to X in Denmark, and there we're really keen on getting the bio-based CO2 so we can actually turn it into fuel and use that without sort of creating another problem that we just reuse CO2 from a fossil-based environment. So I think we will make those distinctions. So those two distinctions, and then the three buckets, I think that would be kind of how our approach would be.
That's really helpful, and I appreciate this distinction between fossil carbon and biogenic carbon, and I think it's a distinction that California is increasingly seeing as well. And both of your governments have done a phenomenal job of sort of road mapping the deployment that's needed to get to important climate targets. And I'm wondering if each of you can elaborate a little bit on what that policy gap is. And for example, Matt, I know the Lawrence Livermore National Lab Getting to Neutral report really focuses on some of these biogenic sources. What's the policy gap that we need to fill to get these solutions to scale in a timely fashion?
Yeah, so I think there's a set of, how do we target the incentives? First is, how do we target the incentives for the scale and the size of the project? Many of these are smaller projects right now because the technologies are relatively new, or they're located far away from, traditional, places where we need something like hydrogen. So can we, deep in the forest, so can we make sure that the incentives themselves are surgical enough to actually reach the intended beneficiaries of the technologies where they are on the development curve? Two is, these are all kind of new things for us, so they don't really fit into our regulatory schemes. How can we make sure that our regulatory scheme, our environment is both protected, public health is protected, but at the same time there is a clear pathway for somebody who wants to take a tree that might burn or decompose and turn into methane, turn it into hydrogen, and put that carbon dioxide in the ground somewhere where there's a source, which may be a couple 100 miles away. So that's a big system that needs to be addressed there. So I think those would be the two biggest ones. And then I would always add, social license. How can we build support for this? And again, that has to be rooted in, community involvement, patience, and doing these tests and pilots in places where, where they have the most support.
I think to add to that, I think we're to be maybe use buckets again. I think we're trying to solve kind of 4 problems. I mean, there's sort of a legal problem that I mean, most of this is illegal currently. So I mean, we need to change quite a lot of legislation to make this possible, and that in itself is going to be difficult because I mean, a lot of the legislation, not even ours, it will be environmental legislation or other agencies. So I think it's quite nice that we had this agreement this summer with all the political parties that this is something we should do, because then it's very easy for them to just do those changes in the legislation. So that's one problem. The second one is of course, as Matt also said about, I mean, the incentives. This is costly. I mean, you don't see companies using these technologies today simply because the price of carbon is not high enough. And we are also currently working on a carbon tax. So I mean, how do you make all of those things fit together? I think that's a huge issue and something we will definitely be addressing in our strategy. And then thirdly, I mean, it's almost like an engineering problem. I mean, you need to have the value chain ready at the same time. I mean, you will have captures. They spend $1 billion on their capture. You will have ships that could sail them around, and you will have storage. And then all of that should be ready at the same time. Otherwise, we'll be wasting a lot of money. And I do think that's also a way where government strategies can sort of come in and say, okay, let's jumpstart the market at a given date. And that would sort of send a strong signal to the market participants that this is actually the date where they should be ready. And the timeline for each of these things are very, very different. And then fourth, I completely agree. I mean, the social acceptance, especially with the storage part. I mean, do people actually want to live close to a shore where you have storage in the water, or do they want to have it underneath the house? I mean, what would be the social acceptance of that? I think that's something we really need to take into account and be quite sensitive about.
Excellent. And so I want to draw a bit more on this point, and particularly the distinction. Both of you have mentioned geologic storage and its important role, obviously negative emissions generally. Is there a role for utilization? What policy can and should drive CO2 utilization? I mean, obviously, there are some promising technologies to do things like injecting it in concrete mixes, for example, or to produce synthetic fuels. Is there an important climate opportunity there? And if so, what's the role of policy in driving, you know, those solutions alongside things like geologic storage?
Anders, do you want to go first on this?
Sure. Sure. I think, I mean, in Denmark, I think it's very much both. I mean, we need to get rid of some CO2. I mean, that's the whole thing about the climate change. I mean, you have too much CO2. I mean, something has to leave the atmosphere, and dumping it into the ground this seems to be a good solution. But that being said, I think, I mean, the use is actually very much in focus in Denmark, and we do believe that there's a very strong case to make artificial fuels. I mean, we heavy transportation, ships, aviation. I mean, you have all of these sectors that need new fuels, and we do believe that the carbon we capture from the biogen sources could be used for that. So there will be another strategy in Denmark for power to X. And we're still debating what the X will be, but it definitely, I mean, we'll make the hydrogen, and then we'll combine that in some chemical way to make new fuel. So we'll definitely be looking at both use and storage.
Yeah, I agree with Anders. 2 buckets. One is permanence, stuff that's going to be there for a long enough time for it to matter, and we know that. And then 2 is, can it displace other high emission, hard to decarbonize areas? So those are the 2 things that I think that we should be looking for. And I'm also very interested in the power to X discussion. I think that it is dangerous to rely on biosources for filling a significant portion of the energy mix. We look at biosources really as a way to store carbon, and there is an added benefit that some of it you can be using for energy. But I think if we're in a place where, you know, we're using palm oil, for example, you know, to create hydrogen, that seems like a really, really bad, it seems like not a good place to be, both for the climate and for, you know, where we're going. In California, we've got 25 million acres of forests, some of which have 20 times the amount of biomass that the that the climate can or will be able to support. That is mostly going to burn, so we're going to have to treat that, and that will be for the next 25 years probably a really good source of some incremental amount of energy. But more importantly, and how we and we're trying to value it that way, it could be a very, very good source for storing carbon and basically pulling carbon out of the carbon cycle.
Yeah, thank you both. Really thoughtful remarks. I guess maybe the point where I sort of want to start wrapping us up is the role of international collaboration in all of this. I think it's obviously important to note that we're very, very early days in all of this. We're, very much in the testing lab of policy in a lot of ways. And while it's unlikely, I think, that the United States and Denmark get to share a geologic storage well anytime soon, just given geographic proximity there. How can we share our near-term policy learnings? California is doing a tremendous amount of experimentation, so is Denmark. How do we have, the cross-collaboration that's necessary to really learn from each other's, mistakes and benefits along the way?
Shall I go first, Matt? I think, I've been doing policy for quite some time now, and I think one of the most important things is to find other countries where you can steal ideas from, and basically copy in your own country. I mean, I think that's the way that Denmark have been doing policy for many years, and it seemed to be working. So I mean, that's just one way. I mean, we really try to understand. I mean, what are the other countries doing? And as you said, I mean, if there's experiments that seem to be working, then let's just use that. I mean, to be honest, I mean, the Danish policy strategy is very much based on what we're seeing in Norway and the Netherlands. I mean, in Europe, they were a bit ahead of us. I mean, we'll be catching up, don't worry. But I mean, there are some great lessons that we can learn from them. And I'm sure that when some of the new technology, I think especially on direct air capture, which I think California is way ahead of us, I think that would be something that we're really keen on following and learning more about, because that's something we need. But I mean, as I said, it's really early days for us.
Yeah, I want to second the idea of taking other people's learnings and applying it. I think that's the best. That's the way we're going to get to decarbonization. I also want to highlight something that was said earlier in the session is that if what we're doing, even if it's even if it's Denmark and California collaborating quite closely, isn't applicable particularly to China and to India and to the rest of Europe or the developing world, it doesn't mean nearly as much. And our part of our responsibility as as climate leaders is to try to do things that work in other parts of the world and can be scaled all over the world. And I think that's really important. And part of that is getting the technology right. Part of that is winning this, getting a social license and having these things work in ways that people go, oh, wow, that's a great thing. And part of it is bringing the cost down in ways that more and more countries can feel like, okay, we can decarbonize and, and we can continue to take care of the material needs of our people. So I think both those goals are collaboration between California and Denmark are super important as leaders, but I also think we need to be mindful of how can we engage, other places that we really need to be engaged in decarbonization.
And looking at the beach behind you, Matt, I think also that Danes need to come to California for study trips quite soon.
Well, I have been to Denmark in the summertime, and it is an incredible place to go. And your beaches have sunlight until like 11 o'clock at night, and that is pretty amazing. Water's a little cold, but still beautiful.
It is, yeah.
Well, so then I think probably the takeaway is that we have some truly tremendous landscapes that are absolutely worth saving and are absolutely worth driving policy to protect. And I think, we've heard the importance of social license, community buy-in throughout this panel. We've also heard, the importance of ecological safeguards, making sure the technologies that we're deploying are beneficial to our ecosystems. And then if we are using biogenic sources like biomass or biogas, that those sources are safe. And I want to thank you both so much for your time and comments throughout the session, and give you an opportunity to share any last thoughts that you have before I turn it back over to our hosts.
I just want to thank you for putting this on. It was really helpful, and it's helpful for us in California to be in communication with our Danish counterparts. California has a long history of working with Denmark on decarbonization and technology advancement. Hopefully this area is one where we can work together like we have on offshore wind and other technologies.
I completely agree. I would have said the same thing. So yeah, let's continue the dialogue, and thank you so much for setting this up.
Wonderful. Thank you both so much, gentlemen. And I will turn it over to our host. Alan, if you'd like to join back, that would be awesome. Thank you.
Thank you, Rory. And thank you to all the panelists. And also a big thank you to the audience for all the lively activity we have seen in the chat. Lots of comments, lots of networking, lots of connectivity. I think there was one question in the chat whether we could share the chat. And yes, we can share what has happened in the chat. We will send it out to you in our follow-up email. Today's keynote and the discussions in the 3 sessions clearly show that we have a lot to do if we want to develop, deploy, and scale the needed carbon removal solutions in due time. The discussions also show that we have a tremendous potential for knowledge sharing and collaboration if we bring the carbon removal communities in the US and Denmark closer together. To do this, we will facilitate further discussions between the US and Danish stakeholders on more specific topics in the coming months. To help us organize this, we would like your feedback both here today in a quick poll and also through a short survey. We will post a link to the survey in the chat and also send it out in a follow-up email. Now you should be able to see the answers in a poll on your screen, and we'd like to know which topics you are most interested in. I'll just give you a brief moment to indicate your interest. Thank you for indicating your interest. I think the result speaks for itself. It seems to be quite a close race, but there's great interest in scaling technologies on one side, and also a great interest in creating markets. But as I mentioned, we will also send out a short survey. And when we add this on top of this poll, I'm sure we'll get a clearer picture of how our deep dive sessions will be organized. As I said, we will get back to you on this later on. Before we end this webinar, I also would like to invite you to engage in all the other follow-up activities that we plan. New partnerships are being formed in Denmark in the fall. We heard from the panels an invitation to US stakeholders to engage with the Danish stakeholders. Future dialogue visits and workshops will enable further dialogue and also collaboration. Hopefully, this will lead to the creation of partnerships and joint projects across the Atlantic. As we have heard today, we need 1,000 shots on goal for carbon removal, and we are confident that some of these shots could be developed and matured by US and Danish businesses, researchers, and regulators working more closely together. Therefore, we look very much forward to continuing the important discussions. Feel free to reach out to us and also to each other. And then I just have to say thank you and have a wonderful rest of your day.